On a barren limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, at a site known as Göbekli Tepe, massive stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons stand arranged in near-perfect circular enclosures. They are carved with remarkable precision, featuring intricate reliefs that suggest planning, coordination, and symbolic intent. The most striking fact is not just what they are, but when they were built, more than 11,000 years ago, predating the Great Pyramids of Egypt by nearly 7,000 years, and existing long before the invention of writing or the emergence of agriculture. This creates a fundamental paradox in the story of human civilization. According to the conventional historical model, large-scale construction requires settled communities, agricultural surplus, and a level of social organization capable of sustaining specialized labor. Yet Gobekli Tepe appears to violate every one of these assumptions. It suggests that a society not supposed to have the necessary complexity was already capable of producing one of the most sophisticated monumental structures of the prehistoric world. The question then becomes unavoidable. Who built this? And how did they coordinate the manpower, knowledge, and engineering required to achieve something that, by standard archaeological logic, should not have been possible at that time? For decades, the dominant interpretation has been relatively conservative. Most researchers have described Gobekli Tepe as a ritual gathering site for mobile hunter-gatherer groups, socially simple, loosely organized, and technologically limited. But that interpretation is beginning to show strain. A new category of evidence has entered the picture: ancient DNA recovered from surrounding regions and later populations. And what that genetic evidence is starting to suggest is unsettling. It does not simply refine the story. It challenges the framework itself. Because DNA is now pointing toward a version of the past that no longer fits neatly into the established narrative of how civilization began. As excavations expanded around Gobekli Tepe and neighboring sites across Upper Mesopotamia, a critical problem emerged. There is remarkably little evidence of the kind of settled agricultural society that conventional models would expect to find alongside such monumental construction. Instead, the stratigraphic record points toward mobile hunter-gatherer populations, seasonal, dispersed groups with no clear signs of permanent settlements or the infrastructure typically associated with large-scale coordinated labor. This directly challenges the long-standing assumption that only agricultural societies could generate the surplus and organizational stability required for monumental architecture. If that assumption holds, Gobekli Tepe should not exist in its current form. Yet it does. The turning point came with the introduction of ancient DNA analysis from Anatolia and the Levant. Research teams associated with the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, along with multiple European paleogenomics laboratories, began reconstructing a far more complex genetic landscape than the traditional linear model of human development suggests. Rather than isolated bands of late Pleistocene hunter-gatherers, the data indicates repeated episodes of gene flow between regional populations stretching across the Levant, Anatolia, and surrounding corridors. These were not static groups. They were interconnected populations engaged in long-term cycles of migration, interbreeding, and regional exchange. What is particularly striking is that genetic signatures associated with pre-agricultural populations persist into communities that appear shortly after the construction phases of Gobekli Tepe. This raises the possibility of a transitional population layer that has not been clearly identified within traditional archaeological classifications. If correct, this blurs the boundary between hunter-gatherer and civilizational builder to the point where the distinction may no longer be analytically reliable. The categories themselves may be artifacts of modern interpretation rather than reflections of ancient reality. And this is only the beginning of the problem. Because as the genetic record becomes clearer, it begins to implicate something even more unexpected, not just how these people lived, but what kind of social forces may have driven them to construct something so massive in the first place. The most unsettling question still remains unanswered. Who, exactly, carries the genetic continuity linked to the builders of Gobekli Tepe? In every interpretation of Gobekli Tepe, there is an uncomfortable truth that is rarely stated openly. Control over historical narrative belongs to those who control the data, not to those who live the reality being studied. And for more than 2 decades after its discovery, The dominant explanatory framework was guided by a single assumption, that civilization, in any meaningful architectural or symbolic sense, only emerged after the adoption of agriculture. That assumption was not just an academic model. It functioned as an intellectual filter. It shaped how prehistoric societies were classified, how stone tools were interpreted, and even how early ritual behavior was understood. When evidence did not fit the model, it was often treated as an anomaly or set aside as insufficiently resolved data. The arrival of ancient DNA fundamentally altered that balance. As independent laboratories across Europe began publishing genomic reconstructions of early populations, particularly through work associated with the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, the narrative ceased to rely solely on material artifacts like stone tools or architectural remains. For the first time, there was a biological record capable of tracing migration patterns and ancestral relationships directly across time. This shift represents a quiet transfer of epistemic authority from descriptive archaeology to data-driven archaeogenetics. And once interpretation moves from physical structures to genomic structure, long-standing assumptions about simplicity versus complexity in prehistoric societies begin to weaken. Some researchers have begun to question whether the familiar categories of hunter-gatherer and early farmer are too rigid to capture what actually existed during this transitional period. If so, then the issue is not simply a lack of data, but a potential misclassification of entire social systems over decades of research. And when the authority to define the past shifts, the most dangerous question emerges. If the established model is incomplete, what else about Gobecli Tepe has been fundamentally misunderstood? For decades, the widely accepted story of Gobekli Tepe rested on a near-absolute assumption. Symbolic and monumental construction only emerged after humans had established stable agricultural societies. This was not merely a hypothesis. It became the default framework in prehistoric archaeology. Within that framework, hunter-gatherer societies were interpreted as fundamentally simple. Dispersed groups with limited coordination, no consistent surplus production, and no capacity to sustain large-scale labor projects. As a result, any monumental structure predating agriculture was treated as structurally improbable, if not effectively impossible, under known models of social organization. But this certainty created a deeper problem. It began shaping interpretation before evidence was fully understood. When the first circular stone enclosures at Gobekli Tepe were uncovered, they were not initially treated as indicators of complex social engineering. Instead, they were categorized as ritual exceptions, symbolic anomalies produced by otherwise simple hunter-gatherer groups. Meanwhile, new lines of evidence emerging from ancient DNA studies began to complicate that picture. Large-scale genomic sequencing efforts conducted across Europe, including research associated with the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, started revealing a population structure in prehistoric Anatolia and the surrounding regions that did not fit the traditional binary model of hunter-gatherer versus farmer. Instead, the genetic data suggests a transitional demographic landscape, continuous cycles of migration, gene flow, and regional interaction that persisted over long periods. These were not isolated groups moving linearly from simplicity to complexity, but interconnected populations adapting dynamically to environmental and social pressures. If that is accurate, then the boundary between non-complex and complex societies may not reflect historical reality at all, but rather a modern classification system imposed on a far more fluid past. And if that foundational framework is incorrect, then even the most basic interpretation of Gobekli Tepe must be reconsidered. Was it truly a purely ritual center, or the remains of a form of social organization that modern anthropology has not yet properly defined? If the traditional model of human history is correct, then a hunter-gatherer society such as the one associated with Gobekli Tepe should not be capable of simultaneously satisfying three conditions: constructing multi-ton stone architecture, maintaining a stable and coordinated labor force over extended periods, and sustaining a level of technical transmission precise enough to reproduce highly standardized symbolic carvings across multiple circular enclosures. Yet the archaeological record suggests that all three conditions were met at the same time. The massive T-shaped pillars were not built as a single isolated event, but appear across multiple construction phases, showing a striking degree of standardization in both form and carving technique. This creates a direct logical tension. Either the social organization of these groups was far more advanced than traditionally assumed, or the frameworks used to classify their society are fundamentally incomplete. Stratigraphic analysis further reinforces this complexity. Excavation layers indicate repeated construction and modification over centuries, not a single burst of activity. At the same time, population genetic studies conducted through collaborative research programs associated with the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History show continuity in regional genetic signatures, with no clear evidence of abrupt population replacement between the pre-construction and post-construction periods. This leaves two mutually exclusive interpretations. Either these communities possessed a form of social organization significantly more complex than the conventional, dispersed hunter-gatherer model allows, or modern classification systems are compressing a more complex social reality into overly simplistic categories that align with pre-existing assumptions. More importantly, both datasets, archaeological and genetic, are not contradicting each other. Instead, they are jointly challenging the interpretive framework itself. When two independent lines of evidence converge on the same point of mismatch, the question is no longer what is unique about Gobekli Tepe, but how much of early human history has been misread through an overly constrained model of social evolution. The real investigation does not begin at the excavation site of Gobekli Tepe, but inside sterile cleanroom laboratories where ancient DNA is reconstructed one fragmented sequence at a time. Among the key contributors are geneticists and molecular anthropologists working at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, alongside a broader network of European paleogenomics laboratories specializing in ancient genome recovery. In this context, archaeology is no longer conducted with shovels alone. It is conducted with enzymes, sequencing machines, and computational reconstruction pipelines. Bone and tooth samples recovered from Anatolia are processed under strictly controlled conditions designed to eliminate modern contamination. The DNA extracted from these remains is heavily degraded, short, fragmented sequences shaped by thousands of years of chemical breakdown. These fragments are then amplified and read using high-throughput sequencing technologies, producing partial genomic datasets that must be computationally reconstructed. The critical point is not any single sample, but the consistency across many. When multiple samples from different stratigraphic layers and time periods converge on similar genetic signals, population-level models begin to emerge. Statistical frameworks such as principal component analysis, PCA, and admixture modeling are then applied to map relationships between ancient populations and infer patterns of migration and interbreeding. Early results do more than simply confirm the presence of hunter-gatherer groups in the Levant-Anatolia corridor. They suggest something more structurally complex. These populations were not isolated units, as previously assumed, but part of a continuous network of genetic exchange spanning highlands, lowlands, and adjacent Mesopotamian regions during the same broad period in which Gobekli Tepe was constructed and used. This leads to a revised hypothesis. Instead of a sharp transition from foraging to agriculture, the region may have experienced a prolonged transitional phase spanning thousands of years, characterized by flexible and interconnected social structures that do not fit neatly into traditional archaeological categories. But the most important signal has not yet been discussed, because in deeper layers of genetic analysis, a recurring pattern begins to emerge, one that does not only reflect human migration, but may also point toward the underlying social forces that made the construction of massive monumental structures possible in the first place. After years of integrated genetic analysis, multi-institutional synthesis models, drawing on research groups at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History and a wider network of ancient genome projects across Europe, began to converge on a single, consistent pattern. There was no singular founding population responsible for the societies associated with monumental construction in this region. Instead, the data points toward a multi-regional genetic network, with significantly higher levels of population admixture than previously assumed. The resulting interpretation is clear. Gobekli Tepe was not the product of a simple, pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer band. It reflects a transitional phase of social complexity, in which mobile foraging populations had already developed sufficient organizational capacity to coordinate large-scale labor through regional alliances and long-distance exchange systems. The underlying mechanism appears to be what population geneticists refer to as admixture pulses, periodic cycles of interbreeding and demographic exchange between groups across the Levant-Anatolia corridor. These repeated genetic interactions created extended kinship networks that functioned as a form of social infrastructure. In environments governed by seasonal resource availability, such networks would have reduced intergroup conflict while increasing the stability required for sustained collaboration across generations. Quantitative models of gene flow indicate that contributions from highland and lowland populations were not static but fluctuated over time, reflecting repeated episodes of migration and reintegration. When combined with stratigraphic data from archaeological excavations, the construction phases at Gobecli Tepe appear to have unfolded over centuries, with multiple cycles of modification and reconstruction rather than a single building event. Crucially, this conclusion is not derived from a single line of evidence. It emerges from the convergence of ancient DNA, isotopic analysis, and field archaeology. When independent methodologies converge on the same structural interpretation, regional population connectivity as a driver of coordination, the traditional model of isolated, low-complexity hunter-gatherer societies becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. If this framework is correct, then the long-held assumption that agricultural surplus is a prerequisite for social complexity no longer holds. That forces a more fundamental question: what actually enabled early human groups to organize labor at this scale in the first place? But the most important question is not how they built it. It is why they eventually walked away from it. Looking at the full body of evidence surrounding Gobekli Tepe, one conclusion becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. Human history is not a straight trajectory from simplicity to complexity. It is better understood as a sequence of social experiments, models of organization that emerge, expand, and eventually disappear without leaving a continuous line of progression. Within this revised framework, hunter-gatherer societies are no longer primitive stages on the way to agriculture. Instead, they appear as highly adaptable systems capable of forming regional alliances, coordinating seasonal labor, and maintaining complex cooperative structures without the need for permanent settlement or agricultural surplus. Genetic research from large-scale ancient DNA initiatives, including those associated with the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, has expanded the understanding of prehistoric mobility and interconnection. But more importantly, it has forced a reevaluation of what we actually mean by progress. If complex social organization existed before agriculture, then agriculture can no longer be treated as the starting point of civilization, only one of several possible developmental pathways. The implication is deeper than archaeology alone. It suggests that the historical narrative most people learn is not a complete record, but a curated reconstruction built from fragmented evidence, organized into the simplest coherent model available at the time. Humans may have been fundamentally misled about the origin point of civilization. Social complexity is not linearly dependent on agricultural development, and what we call evolution may not be a straight ascent, but a cycle of emergence, experimentation, and disappearance. Which leaves one final question, still anchored in stone across millennia. If a society capable of building Gobekli Tepe once existed, how many other chapters of human history were lost before we even had the chance to recognize them? Perhaps the issue has never been the absence of answers, but the absence of the right questions.